The story grabs immediate attention by contrasting the primal messy triumph of labor with the clinical high-fashion coldness of the elite. Within the opening moments, the viewer is thrust into a modern hospital room at the Blue Hour, where Marsha W. Johnson is physically and emotionally shattered after delivering the Seok heirs. The narrative tension is built on visual dissonance. Marsha's damp, matted afro and deep crimson hospital gown represent the raw reality of life, while Baek Beom-seok's slicked-back ponytail and razor-sharp suit represent a world that views human vulnerability as a brand failure. The introduction relies on visceral indignation and class-based cruelty. It centers on the inciting indignity, Baek's refusal to touch his sons Beom-jun and Beom-min, because their mother's current state offends his aesthetic sensibilities. When he delivers the line, "I can't be seen with you like this," he isn't just leaving a wife, he is performing a corporate debranding of a human being. This creates an immediate villain archetype out of Baek and forces the audience to root for Marsha as she shifts from a victim of shattered hope into the decided quiet of the architect. The discharge from the hospital was not a parade. It was a quiet evacuation. Marsha sat in the wheelchair provided by the hospital, her body still humming with a dull, throbbing ache that felt as though her bones had been rearranged. In her lap, she held the double car seat, Beom-jun and Beom-min bundled in the white receiving blankets that were now the only things they owned. She was still wearing the crimson hospital scrubs, the fabric a stark, bloody contrast against the sterile white tiles of the corridor. The color felt like a warning, a physical manifestation of the wound Baek had left in her chest. At the curb, the Blue Hour had faded into a bruised purple twilight. Baek's sleek black Maybach was gone, replaced by a rusted 2012 sedan that shook as it idled. Ruth was at the wheel, her knuckles white against the cracked leather of the steering wheel. As she saw Marsha emerge, Ruth scrambled out, her face a mask of fury and heartbreak. "Don't say it," Marsha whispered as Ruth helped her maneuver the twins into the back seat. Marsha's voice was thin like paper being torn. "If you say his name, I'll break, and I can't afford to break yet." Ruth didn't say a word. She just wrapped an arm around Marsha's shoulders, feeling the tremors running through her friend's frame, and guided her into the passenger seat. The interior of the car smelled of old upholstery and cheap vanilla air freshener, a world away from the sandalwood and Italian leather of the Seok estate. As they pulled away from the curb, Marsha looked into the side mirror. She watched the glowing lights of the hospital recede, and with them the life she thought she was building. She thought of the nursery back at the mansion, the hand-carved mahogany cribs, the silk wallpaper, the designer clothes that her sons would never wear. Madame Seok would have already ordered the room cleared, scrubbed of Marsha's scent as if she were a temporary infection that had finally been cured. "Where are we going?" Ruth asked softly, her eyes darting to the rearview mirror to check on the sleeping infants. Marsha reached into the pocket of her scrubs and felt the cold, hard edges of the flash drive shin had pressed into her hand. "To the old industrial district. There's a loft on 4th Street. My grandfather. He left me the deed to it years ago. I thought it was just a tax write-off. I didn't realize it was a lifeboat." The drive was jarring. Every pothole they hit sent a spike of pain through Marsha's abdomen, a reminder of the 14 hours of labor that Baek had dismissed as an inconvenience to his image. She stared out the window at the passing city, the neon signs of Seoul's nightlife blurring into streaks of light. She felt a strange, hollow sense of weightlessness. For 3 years she had been Mrs. Baek, a woman defined by the man on her arm and the shadow of the matriarch behind him. Now she was nothing. Or perhaps she was finally something else. "He filed the annulment 2 weeks ago, Ruth," Marsha said, her gaze fixed on the flashing lights of a passing police car. "Before the babies were even born. He knew exactly what he was going to do. He waited until I was at my weakest to tell me I was ugly. He wanted the last image I had of myself to be the one he created." Ruth swerved slightly, her voice thick with rage. "He's a monster, Marsha. And his mother is the devil in a Chanel suit." "No," Marsha said, and for the first time, her voice regained a sliver of its architectural precision. "They aren't monsters. Monsters are unpredictable. The Sooks are just businessmen. They see people as assets or liabilities. Tonight I was liquidated." She looked back at her sons. They were beautiful, their porcelain skin glowing in the dim light of the cabin, their tiny breaths hitching in unison. They were the only part of Baek she would keep, the only part of that world that wasn't poisoned. They think they left me with $43 and a ruined body, Marsha whispered, her fingers tightening around the flash drive. But they forgot who my grandfather was. They forgot that you can't tear down a structure until you understand how the foundation was poured. As the beat-up car crossed the bridge into the darkened warehouse district, Marsha didn't look back at the skyline. She watched the twins, her eyes hardening from the shattered hope of the hospital room into something cold, dark, and permanent. The victim was staying behind at the hospital. The architect was going home. The loft on 4th Street was a cavern of shadows and cold concrete, smelling of decades-old dust and forgotten machinery. Ruth had helped Marsha settle the twins into a makeshift nest of blankets atop a worn velvet sofa, the only piece of furniture that didn't feel like a relic, before heading out to find milk and basic supplies. Left alone in the silence, Marsha felt the true weight of her exile. The high-reaching windows looked out onto a skyline dominated by the glowing Suk Tower, a needle of light that seemed to mock her from across the river. She sat on a wooden crate, her body screaming for the rest it wouldn't receive, and pulled the flash drive from her pocket. Beside it lay a heavy, cream-colored envelope that Shin, the head of security, had tucked into her bag during the frantic exit from the hospital. He had been with the Suk family for 20 years, a silent shadow with a neck tattoo that matched Baek's, a mark of the underworld they both inhabited. But Shin had looked at Marsha with something like mourning when he handed her the files. "Your husband doesn't know what he's thrown away," he had whispered. "But your grandfather did. He knew they would try to erase you." Marsha opened the envelope first. Inside was a single, aged photograph of her grandfather, Johnson Wilshire, standing next to a much younger, less polished version of Baek's own grandfather. They were shaking hands in front of a modest shipyard. Attached to the photo was a legal summary that made the breath catch in Marsha's throat. For years, the story she had been told, the story the Suks had carefully curated, was that Johnson Wilshire had been a simple laborer, a man lucky to have been employed by the great Suk dynasty. The truth in the file was a violent contradiction. Johnson hadn't been a servant. He had been the financier. During the post-war reconstruction, it was Wilshire's offshore capital that had saved the Suk family from bankruptcy. In exchange, he had been granted a silent 40% stake in the founding equity of what would become the SUNTC empire. Marsha's hands shook as she scrolled through the digital files on the flash drive using her old laptop. Shin had decrypted internal ledgers that Madame Suk thought were buried in the bedrock of their private servers. There it was, the Wilshire clause. It was a dormant legal trigger, a poison pill designed by her grandfather to ensure that if his lineage was ever severed from the family through malice or betrayal, the equity would revert from a silent trust into an active voting majority. By serving her annulment papers and discarding her like a broken asset, Baek hadn't just ended a marriage. He had inadvertently triggered a structural collapse of his own throne. He had treated her like a liability because she was unsightly in her pain, never realizing that she was the very foundation the Suk Tower was built upon. The files also contained Shin's personal notes. He had been tracking the money for years, watching as Madame Suk siphoned off billions into ghost subsidiaries to hide the true value of the Wilshire stake. The $43 in Marsha's bank account was a calculated insult, but the numbers on the screen, $4.2 billion in original equity, now valued at 10 times that, were a declaration of war. Marsha leaned back, the blue light of the laptop screen reflecting in her glassy, bloodshot eyes. The physical pain was still there. The exhaustion still threatened to pull her under, but the shattered hope was gone. It had been replaced by a cold architectural clarity. She looked at her sleeping sons, the two tiny boys who carried the Wilshire blood and the Suk name. They wanted a brand architect, she whispered into the hollow space of the loft. Her voice didn't tremble this time. "I'm going to show them what happens when you try to renovate a building while the foundation is moving." She didn't close the laptop. She began to map out the names of the 8 major clients who held the rest of the Suk debt. She wasn't just going to survive. She was going to redesign the world that had tried to delete her. The Wilshire file wasn't just a secret. It was the blueprint for a total demolition. The transformation began not with a grand gesture, but with the rasp of steel against hair. Marsha stood before the cracked mirror in the loft's cramped bathroom, the fluorescent light flickering overhead like a dying pulse. She looked at the woman in the reflection, The woman Baek had called unpresentable, the woman whose soft features were still mapped with the exhaustion of childbirth. With a pair of heavy industrial shears, she began to cut. The voluminous dark afro, the crown that had once been a symbol of her vulnerability and his supposed affection, fell in thick silent coils onto the cold tile floor. She didn't stop until her head was shorn close, revealing the sharp, regal structure of her skull. The softness was gone. When she wiped the steam from the glass, a stranger stared back. This woman had high, hollow cheekbones and eyes that no longer looked for rescue. She was no longer a wife, she was a silhouette. For the next 8 weeks, the loft became a laboratory of cold intent. While the twins slept in their nests of fleece, Marsha lived in the dark room, a corner of the loft she had rigged with 3 monitors and a dedicated server, shielded by the encryption protocol Shin had taught her. She didn't just study the Seok family's finances, she dissected them. She learned the rhythms of their trade, the specific scent of their desperation, and the fragile ego that drove Baek's every expansion. She realized that the world of high-level corporate strategy was nothing more than architecture. Every empire had a load-bearing wall, and every load-bearing wall had a pressure point. She began to build the Architect, an anonymous digital entity that offered structural solutions to the Seok family's fiercest competitors. She didn't use her name. She used a voice modulator that stripped her tone of gender and warmth, leaving only the clinical precision of a machine. The physical toll was immense. She survived on black coffee and the primal adrenaline of motherhood, her body leaning out into something wiry and dangerous. She practiced the decided quiet that the transcript of her life now demanded. When the twins cried, she moved with a silent, ghostly efficiency, her mind never leaving the spreadsheets. She was teaching herself to exist in the spaces between the lines of code. By the 3rd month, the first brick was pulled. A mid-sized logistics firm in Singapore, a longtime thorn in the Seok family's side, received an unsolicited dossier from an encrypted source. It detailed a flaw in the Seok family's shipping insurance, a gap large enough to sink a fleet. The firm moved instantly, and the Seok group lost 4% of its market share in a single afternoon. In the quiet of the loft, Marsha watched the red candles flicker on the stock ticker. She didn't smile. Triumph was a luxury for people who still felt. She simply opened a new file and labeled it Phase 2. She was no longer hiding in the warehouse district. She was haunting it. She had turned her unpresentable state into a cloak of invisibility. From the darkness of her corner, the architect began to sketch the blueprints for a world where the Seok name was nothing more than a footnote in a history of ruin. She looked at the twins, who were beginning to track her movements with wide, curious eyes. "I'm building you a kingdom," she whispered, her voice like the rustle of dry leaves. "And I'm building it out of the stones they threw at us." The first structural failure in the Seok empire didn't happen with a roar. It happened with a signature. For months, the Seok group had leaned heavily on Seok Logistics, a subsidiary that controlled the specialized cold storage ports essential for their pharmaceutical exports. It was the jugular of their supply chain, a mid-tier company that Madame Seok treated as a personal vault. Baek had been so preoccupied with the upcoming IPO and the erasure of Marsha from his public records that he hadn't noticed the subtle predatory movement in the shadow of his own board meetings. Marsha sat in the loft, the twins now old enough to babble softly in their sleep, their voices the only warmth in the cavernous space. On her center screen, a news ticker began to scroll in a frantic neon red. Hansen Global acquires Seok Logistics in hostile takeover. Baek would be at his desk right now, staring at the screen with that sharp, furrowed brow, wondering how he had lost a majority voting bloc in 48 hours. He wouldn't find the answer in the public filings. He would have to look into the dark room, where Marsha had spent weeks identifying the 3 disgruntled minority shareholders who held the swing votes. She had approached them through a series of shell companies, offering them an exit strategy that promised twice the market value, funded entirely by the dormant Wilshire capital she had unlocked. The beauty of the strike was its architectural purity. She hadn't just taken a company, she had taken Baek's leverage. Without the ports, the Seok Group's pharmaceutical contracts were effectively frozen. Marsha leaned back, the blue light of the monitor catching the hard, new lines of her face. Her shorn hair had grown into a sleek, disciplined crop, framing eyes that had forgotten how to cry. She watched a live feed of the Seok Tower lobby, where a swarm of reporters was already gathering. 10 minutes later, Baek appeared. He looked flawless, the jet-black ponytail perfectly secured, the tailored suit hugging his frame, but the camera caught the slight erratic pulse in his neck tattoo. He was rattled. He was looking for an enemy he couldn't see. "He's looking for a ghost," Ruth whispered, entering the loft with a bag of groceries. She stood behind Marsha, looking at the screens. "Does he have any idea it's you?" "No," Marsha said, her voice a low melodic rasp. "He thinks I'm still in a hospital bed somewhere, mourning the woman he told me I was. He thinks the architect is a rival billionaire from London or Dubai. He's looking for a man with a checkbook, not a mother with a blueprint." She tapped a key, sending a pre-written, encrypted message to the CEO of Hansen Global. It contained the next set of coordinates: the private debt records of the Seok family's real estate holdings. The first strike was over. The Seok family had lost their ports, but more importantly, they had lost their sense of security. Madame Seok would be screaming at her advisors, demanding to know who was behind the Hansen move, never realizing the call was coming from inside the foundation they had tried to bury. Marsha stood up, her body moving with a newfound predatory grace. She walked over to the twins, touching Beom-seok's cheek with a finger that was steady as a surgeon's. "One pillar down," she murmured. 11 to go. The shattered hope of the hospital room felt like a dream from another life. In this life, Marsha W. Johnson didn't hope. She calculated. And the math was beginning to look like a funeral for the Seok dynasty. The digital digging began at midnight, when the city of Seoul was nothing but a grid of indifferent lights and the twins were finally still. Marsha sat at her terminal, the glow of the triple monitors reflecting in her eyes like the targeting system of a long-range weapon. She was no longer looking for money. She was looking for the ghost of the man who had predicted her downfall. Johnson Wilshire had been a man of immense silence, a grandfather who had given her wooden blocks as a child while he built a fortress of paper and ink to protect her future. She bypassed the secondary firewalls of the SUNTC mainframes, using a backdoor protocol Shin had hidden within a routine maintenance update. Deep within the architecture of the company's founding bylaws, buried under layers of legalese and dead-end subdirectories, she found it. The document was titled Article 4, Subsection C, but in the metadata, it was simply tagged as the Wilshire Clause. As Marsha scrolled through the scanned pages of the original 1974 agreement, her breath hitched. Her grandfather hadn't just been a financier. He had been the Seok family's ultimate architect. He had understood the nature of power better than Baek or Madame Seok ever would. The clause was a dead man's switch designed for a specific type of betrayal. It stated that if the Seok bloodline ever attempted to legally sever the Wilshire heirs from the family's common interest through bad faith annulment or purposeful impoverishment, the silent 40% equity would immediately gain full voting rights. It was a trap that had been set 50 years ago. By serving Marsha those papers in the hospital, by calling her a liability and walking away while she was physically undone, Baek had inadvertently turned the key in the lock. He thought he was purging a stain from his brand. Instead, he had handed her the deed to his empire. Marsha leaned into the screen, her fingers flying across the keys as she cross-referenced the clause with recent C filings. Madame Seok had spent decades trying to dilute the Wilshire stake, creating dozens of shell companies to bury the original agreement. But Marsha saw the pattern. It was like looking at a blueprint where the support beams had been hidden behind drywall. The structure was still there, and it was holding up the entire building. The Wilshire Clause didn't just give her money. It gave her the power to fire the board of directors. It gave her the power to veto the upcoming IPO. It gave her the power to unmake Baek Beom-seok. A low vibrating hum began in Marsha's chest. Not a laugh, but the sound of a machine coming to life. She looked at the twins, Beom-jun and Beom-min, sleeping soundly in the shadow of the monitors. They were the Wilshire heirs the clause was written to protect. Every insult Baek had hurled at her, every tear she had shed on those crimson hospital scrubs, was now being converted into equity. She opened a new, encrypted file and began to draft a formal notice of activation. She wasn't ready to send it yet. The architecture of revenge required a specific timing. She needed Baek to be at the absolute height of his confidence, the moment just before the IPO launched when the fall would be terminal. "You thought I was a ghost," she whispered to the flickering image of Baek on the news feed. But a ghost can't hold a pen. A ghost can't sign your execution order. She closed the bylaws, the decided quiet of the loft settling around her. She was no longer just the architect of a consulting firm. She was the rightful owner of the ground. Baek walked on. She pulled her cardigan tighter around her thinning frame, her eyes never leaving the screen. The hunt was transitioning from the shadows into the light. The ghost of Johnson Wilshire was no longer a memory. He was a weapon, and Marsha finally knew exactly how to aim him. The air inside the executive suite of the Suk Tower was thin, pressurized by a silence that felt like a physical weight. Baek Beom-seok stood before the floor-to-ceiling windows, the blue hour casting a sharp, cinematic light across his sculpted jawline. Usually this view of Seoul made him feel like a god, but tonight, the city looked like a series of teeth ready to close. The vertical tattoo on his neck throbbed with a dull rhythm, a physical manifestation of the stress he was forbidden to show. His empire was bleeding, and he couldn't find the wound. On the massive mahogany desk behind him, 3 tablets glowed with catastrophic data. The loss of the cold storage ports had been the first domino, but now a second had fallen. A massive short cell attack had begun on Sunk's primary construction division, executed with such surgical precision that it felt less like a market fluctuation and more like an assassination. It wasn't just about the money, it was the timing. The IPO was less than a month away, and the predator seemed to know the exact moment the Suk family's liquidity was at its lowest. "He's not answering our calls," a voice said from the shadows of the room. Madame Suk sat in an armchair, her spine as straight as a blade, her expression a mask of porcelain fury. She didn't need to specify who he was. The architect, the ghost in the machine who was systematically dismantling their collateral, had ignored every back-channel overture they had made. "It's not a he, Mother," Baek said, his voice a low, dangerous rasp. "It's a machine. No human being can map our debt structures this quickly. They're hitting the cross-collateralization points we didn't even report to the auditors." "Then find the man who built the machine," she snapped, the silk of her sleeve rustling. "We are being liquidated in broad daylight, Beom-seok. If the stock drops another 6 points, the margin calls will trigger. We won't just lose the IPO, we will lose the house in Bel Air. We will lose everything." Baek turned, his intense gaze falling on the security monitor that displayed the building's perimeter. For a fleeting, irrational second he thought of Marsha. He thought of the way she used to look at him, her eyes soft and full of a hope that he had found increasingly unpresentable. He remembered the smell of the hospital room, the stargazer lilies masking the scent of the blood he had walked away from. He pushed the thought down. Marsha was a ghost he had exorcised, a $43 liability he had deleted from his ledger. She didn't have the mind for this. She was too soft, too emotional. He returned to his desk and opened an encrypted channel. He was desperate enough to do the one thing his mother had warned him against. He was going to invite the predator in. He drafted a message to the anonymous server associated with the architect. It was a plea disguised as a business proposition, a request for a private consultation to realign the Suk Group's structural integrity. He was offering a seat at the table to the person who was currently burning the table down. "I've sent the invite," Baek whispered, staring at the blinking cursor. "If they want money, we'll pay. If they want power, we'll negotiate." In the silence of the loft across the river, Marsha watched the notification appear on her screen. The blue light caught the ghost of a smile on her lips, not a smile of joy, but the grim satisfaction of an engineer watching a bridge collapse exactly where they had placed the charges. Baek was no longer the powerful CEO walking away from a hospital bed. He was a man drowning in a sea of his own arrogance, reaching out to the very hand he had pushed away. She didn't reply immediately. She let the cursor blink. She wanted him to wait. She wanted him to feel the exact moment when the flawless brand became a ruin. She looked at her sons, then back at the screen. The architect was ready to take the meeting. The digital meeting was set for 3 in the morning, the hour of the wolf, when the human mind is at its most fragile and the shadows of the warehouse district felt like solid walls. Marsha sat in the dark room, the only light in the loft emanating from the cold, blue glow of her triple monitor setup. She had spent the last hour calibrating the voice modulator. It was a sophisticated piece of software that stripped the melodic, warm lilt from her speech, replacing it with a metallic, genderless resonance that sounded like tectonic plates shifting. On the center screen, a connection request pinged. Marsha clicked the icon, and the face of Baek Beom-seok filled her world. He was in his private study, his black suit jacket discarded, his white shirt unbuttoned at the collar to reveal the calligraphy tattoo on his neck. He looked exhausted, the sculpted perfection of his features marred by dark circles under his heavy lids. He was leaning into the camera, searching for a face that wasn't there. Marsha's camera was disabled. She was nothing but a pulsing waveform on his screen. Architect. Baek's voice was a desperate rasp, a sound Marsha had never heard him make during their marriage. I received your confirmation. I'll be brief. My company is under a coordinated structural assault. I need to know who is behind the Hansen move, and I need a counter-strategy before the markets open. Marsha closed her eyes for a second, absorbing the sound of his voice, the voice that had told her she was unsightly, the voice that had served her annulment papers while her body was still healing. She leaned into the microphone. Your strategy is already flawed, Mr. Baek, she said through the modulator. The sound that came out was clinical, icy, and entirely unrecognizable. You are looking for an external enemy when your foundation is the problem. You have built a tower on ground you do not own. Baek flinched at the sound, his brow furrowing. He adjusted his tie out of habit, a nervous tic. I don't understand. Our holdings are secure. Our legacy is ironclad. Legacy is a branding term, Marsha replied, her fingers dancing across the keys to bring up the hidden Wilshire ledgers on her private screen. In reality, a legacy is just a series of debts. You are currently 34% over-leveraged in your construction division. You have ignored the silent equity holders who funded your grandfather's original yard. You have been walking on a glass floor, Beom-seok, and you finally started to stomp. Baek froze. He leaned closer to the monitor, his gaze intense. How do you know that name? The shipyard was closed 40 years ago. I know everything about the structures you try to hide, she said, her voice dropping to a low, vibrating hum. I know about the $4.2 billion in original equity. I know about the Wilshire clause. And I know that your mother spent the last decade trying to delete the person who holds the key to your vault. Who are you? Baek demanded, his voice rising with a mixture of fear and awe. Are you with the London group? Did Shin leak the internal files to you? I am the consequence of your choices, Marsha said. The decided quiet of the loft seemed to amplify the power of her words. You asked for a consultation. Here is my advice. Stop looking for the predator in the city. Look for the woman you thought was a liability. The structure is falling because you removed the support beam. What woman? Baek whispered, his hand going to the tattoo on his neck. There is no one. I've purged the board. I've cleaned the books. Then you are already blind, Marsha said. She watched him through the lens, seeing the man who had once been her entire world reduced to a confused, breaking figure on a screen. He looked at the waveform, begging it for answers, never realizing the woman he had discarded was sitting less than 5 miles away, watching him crumble in high definition. The next strike will be your real estate holdings, she continued, her tone as final as a gavel. Unless you can find the Wilshire heir before the IPO, the Sook name will be removed from the building by Friday. Wait, Baek started, but Marsha cut the connection. The screen went black, leaving her in the silence of the warehouse. Her heart was thudding against her ribs, but her hands were steady. She looked over at the twins, who were dreaming of a world that was no longer ruled by the man on the screen. She felt a surge of cold, architectural triumph. He hadn't recognized her. To him, she was no longer Marsha. She was the inevitable ruin he had built for himself. She stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the Sook Tower. The lights were still on in his office. I'm not the liability, Baek, she whispered to the dark. I'm the landlord. Madame Sook did not move with the frantic energy of her son. She sat in the dim light of the Sook Tower library, a room paneled in rare dark wood that felt more like a mausoleum than a place of study. On the desk before her lay the transcript of Baek's digital consultation with the architect. She had read it 6 times, her eyes narrowing until they were nothing more than slivers of cold obsidian. She was not looking at the numbers. She was looking at the syntax, the specific surgical way the voice on the screen had dissected their history. The Wilshire clause, she whispered to the empty room. The name felt like a piece of broken glass in her throat. For 30 years she had systematically buried that name. She had shredded documents, closed overseas accounts, and rewritten the company's history until Johnson Wilshire was nothing more than a ghost story. She had even chosen Marsha as Beck's wife because she believed the girl was the weakest link in the Wilshire chain. A soft, romantic architect who would be easy to control and even easier to discard once the heirs were produced. But the transcript in her hands suggested a terrifying miscalculation. The enemy didn't just want their money. They knew the exact legal mechanism required to take their throne. This wasn't a corporate raid. It was an inheritance reclaim. A cold shiver, unfamiliar and unwelcome, traced its way down Madame Sook's spine. She thought of the hospital room, of the way she had dictated the very insults Beck had used to break Marsha. She had wanted to ensure the girl left with her spirit so crushed that she would never think to look at a ledger or a lawyer. Beom-seok, she called out, her voice sharp enough to cut the heavy air. Beck entered the room, his tie still loosened, his face a map of mounting panic. Mother, the margin calls. Forget the margin calls, she hissed, standing up. The silk of her traditional dress hissed against the floorboards. Who else knew about Article 4? Who else had access to your grandfather's private shipyard files? Beck blinked, taken aback by the venom in her tone. No one. Those files were destroyed in the 2012 server migration. You oversaw it yourself. Then we have a leak in the foundation, she said, walking toward the window that faced the river. This architect mentioned the woman we thought was a liability. They are mocking us, Beom-seok. They are telling us that the person we threw away is the one holding the match. She turned to face him, her porcelain skin looking translucent in the moonlight. For the first time in his life, Beck saw something in his mother's eyes that looked remarkably like fear. It wasn't the fear of losing money. It was the fear of being seen. Find Shin, she commanded. He has been missing since the night of the delivery. If he has the Wilshire files, he is the one who sold us to this architect. And find that girl. Find Marsha. I don't care if she's in a gutter or a shelter. I want her found, and I want her silenced before she realizes what her name is worth. Mother, Marsha has nothing to do with this, Beck argued, though his voice lacked conviction. She's probably still crying in some low-rent apartment. She doesn't have the stomach for this kind of war. You fool, Madame Sook whispered, her gaze returning to the transcript. You looked at her and saw a stain on the brand. I look at these words and I see a woman who has spent 10 months building a cage for us. If this architect is who I think it is, we didn't just walk away from a wife. We walked away from the owner of this building. She dismissed him with a wave of her hand, but as he left, she stayed by the window. She watched the dark waters of the Han River, wondering how a woman she had deemed unpresentable had managed to become invisible enough to dismantle an empire. The decided quiet of the Sook Tower was no longer a sign of power. It was the silence of a tomb. The legal finalization of the Wilshire inheritance took place not in a courtroom, but in the sterile high-security vault of a private trust firm specializing in old-world reparations. Marsha stood between two massive titanium tables, her presence now commanding a room that was designed to intimidate. She wore a tailored suit of charcoal gray, her shorn hair lending her the silhouette of a woman carved from obsidian. On the tables lay the birth certificates of Beom-jun and Beom-min, placed alongside the original 1974 partnership deed signed by her grandfather. The attorney, a man who had served the Wilshire estate in silence for 40 years, looked at Marsha with a mixture of reverence and relief. He had waited decades for a Wilshire to walk through his door with the iron key. The encrypted digital signature Shin had recovered from the flash drive. Your grandfather was very specific, Miss Johnson, the attorney said, his voice echoing in the vaulted space. He knew the Sook family's nature. He called them architects of the surface. He knew that one day they would try to scrape you away to preserve their facade. That is why the trust is not in your name, but in the names of your sons. You are the executor, the hand that moves the pieces, but they are the owners. Marsha watched as the attorney began the process of digital verification. On a wall-mounted screen, a complex spiderweb of global assets began to shift. The Wilshire Clause wasn't just a legal footnote anymore. It was an active predatory protocol. As the twins' DNA profiles, captured in the hospital moments after their birth, merged with the trust's biometric locks, the ownership of the founding 40% equity of S&T officially transitioned from a pending status to active. Marsha felt a profound, chilling sense of peace. The $43 she had been left with was now a mathematical ghost. In its place was a fortune so vast it could buy the very hospital where she had been shamed. But more importantly, the legal status of her sons was now unassailable. In the eyes of the law, they were no longer the unpresentable byproduct of a ruined marriage. They were the majority creditors of the Sook Group. "It is done," the attorney whispered, handing her a black titanium card. "As of this moment, the Sook Group's IPO cannot proceed without your personal authorization. You hold the leverage. You are the load-bearing wall." Marsha took the card, its weight cold in her palm. She thought of the Rembrandt lighting of that hospital room, the way the dusk had turned the sky blue while Beck told her she was a stain on his brand. She realized then that her grandfather hadn't just left her money. He had left her a masterpiece of structural revenge. He had known that the only way to truly defeat the Sooks was to own the air they breathed. "They think they are preparing for an IPO," Marsha said, her voice a low architectural rasp. "They think they are walking toward a podium. They don't realize they are walking toward a cliff." She walked out of the vault and back into the sunlight of the city. The wind caught her coat, and for the first time in 10 months, she didn't feel the phantom weight of her ruined body. She felt the weight of an empire. The twins were safe. Their legacy was ironclad. Now, all that remained was the final demolition of the man who thought he could walk away. The invitation arrived not as a digital notification, but as a physical artifact, a heavy cream-colored card embossed with the Sook family crest in gold foil. It was an invitation to the pre-IPO gala, the event designed to signal the SUNTC empire's global dominance to the world's most powerful investors. For Beck and Madame Sook, it was a desperate gamble, a public performance of strength to mask the structural rot spreading through their ledgers. But for Marsha, it was the final coordination of the demolition. Marsha sat in the loft, the shadows of the warehouse district pressing against the glass. On her screen, the anonymous portal for the architect was open. She had let Beck's previous 3 messages sit in the digital void, ripening with his desperation. He had offered equity, he had offered seats on the board, he had offered everything but the one thing he didn't realize she already held: the truth. She leaned into the microphone, her finger hovering over the voice modulator. "Mr. Beck." The metallic, shifting resonance filled the quiet room. "I have reviewed your proposal. A digital consultation is no longer sufficient for the structural realignment your company requires. If you want the architect to save your foundation, the architect must see the cracks in person." On the other end of the line, miles away in the sterile heights of the Sook Tower, Marsha heard the sharp, ragged intake of Beck's breath. He was terrified, but he was relieved. He thought the predator had finally agreed to become an ally. "I understand." Beck's voice was a frantic rasp. "The gala is tomorrow night. We have a private suite reserved for high-stakes negotiations. You will have full security clearance. No one will see your face if that is your wish." "I will be there," Marsha replied, her tone as cold and precise as a scalpel. "But understand this. When an architect enters a building that is failing, they do not come to paint the walls. They come to decide if the structure is worth saving." She cut the connection before he could respond. Turning away from the monitors, Marsha walked to the center of the loft where a long black garment bag hung from a rolling rack. She unzipped it slowly. Inside was a gown of molten gold, a dress that didn't just capture light, but seemed to generate it. Beside it, on a small wooden stool, sat a pair of vintage diamond earrings that had belonged to her grandmother, the only pieces of the Wilshire legacy that weren't tied up in trusts or offshore accounts. She looked at her reflection in the cracked mirror. Her hair was now a sharp, disciplined crop that emphasized the steely resolve in her eyes. The shattered hope of the woman in the crimson hospital scrubs was a ghost she had finally laid to rest. She no longer felt the phantom weight of Beck's insults or the sting of Madame Sook's scripted cruelty. She felt like a pillar of reinforced steel. Ruth entered from the kitchen, holding the twins. She looked at the gold dress, then at Marsha, and a slow, fierce smile spread across her face. They're expecting a ghost, Marsha. They're expecting a businessman in a dark suit. They're expecting a savior, Marsha corrected her, her voice dropping to a low melodic rasp. And that is their final mistake. You cannot hire the person you tried to destroy to fix the house you built on their bones. She reached out and touched the gold fabric, her mind already moving through the floor plan of the Sook Gala. She knew every exit, every security camera, and every ego in that room. The architect wasn't just attending a party. She was attending a foreclosure. Tomorrow, Marsha whispered, looking at her sons. The world sees you. And the world stops seeing them. The decided quiet of the loft felt different tonight. It wasn't the silence of hiding. It was the silence of a fuse that had finally reached the powder. The invitation was on the table, the gold was ready, and the foundation was set to blow. The grand ballroom of the Sook Tower was a cathedral of glass and ego, illuminated by crystal chandeliers that hung like frozen explosions from the ceiling. Beneath them, the elite of Seoul and the titans of global finance moved in a synchronized dance of champagne and hushed whispers. At the center of the room, Baek Beom-seok stood beside Madame Sook, a living portrait of dynastic power. He was dressed in a tuxedo so black it seemed to absorb the light, his jet-black ponytail secured with a silver band, his neck tattoo a dark omen above his white collar. Beside him, his mother was a monolith in emerald silk, her face a mask of porcelain perfection that betrayed none of the terror rotting her foundation. They were waiting for the architect. They were expecting a man, perhaps a silver-haired European fix-it or a shadowy tech mogul. They were looking for someone who matched the cold, metallic resonance of the voice on the screen. Then, the heavy oak doors at the top of the marble staircase swung open. The room didn't just go quiet, the air seemed to leave it. Marsha W. Johnson stood at the precipice of the stairs, framed by the Rembrandt lighting of the foyer sconces. She was a vision of high-contrast defiance. The gold gown she wore didn't just drape over her. It acted as armor, its structured architectural lines tracing a body that was no longer undone, but forged in fire. Her shorn hair gave her an ancient, queenly silhouette, and the Wilshire diamonds at her ears caught every flicker of light in the room. She didn't wait for an introduction. She began her descent, her steps unhurried and precise. With every stair she claimed, the decided quiet she had practiced in the loft expanded until it filled the entire ballroom. Baek froze. His champagne glass tilted precariously in his hand as his intense gaze locked onto the woman approaching him. His brow furrowed in a confusion that slowly morphed into a soul-deep recognition. He looked at the high cheekbones, the deep mahogany skin glowing with a steely luster, and the eyes, those glassy, bloodshot eyes from the hospital, were gone. In their place were two spheres of dark amber, cold and calculating. Marsha. The name left his lips as a strangled ghost of a sound. Beside him, Madame Sook's hand tightened on her fan until the wood creaked. Her eyes widened, the slivers of obsidian reflecting the molten gold of Marsha's dress. She recognized the threat instantly. This wasn't just the wife they had discarded. This was the physical manifestation of the Wilshire claws. Marsha reached the bottom of the stairs and stopped exactly 3 feet from Baek, close enough for him to smell the scent of stargazer lilies, a deliberate, stinging echo of the hospital room. She didn't look like a victim. She looked like the person who owned the air he was breathing. "Mr. Baek," Marsha said. She didn't use the voice modulator. She used her own voice, low, melodic, and devastatingly clear. "You asked for a consultation. You said your foundation was failing." The socialites and investors leaned in, sensing the shift in the atmosphere. The cameras of the press, originally there to capture the IPO launch, began to swivel toward the woman in gold. "What are you doing here?" Madame Sook hissed, stepping forward to shield her son. "This is a private event for the stakeholders of this empire. You are a trespasser." Marsha turned her gaze toward the matriarch, a slow, predatory tilt of her head. "A trespasser, Madame Sook? That's an interesting architectural term for someone whose name is on the deed." She reached into her small, structured clutch and pulled out a black titanium card, holding it up so the light hit the Wilshire crest. "I'm not here as your guest," Marsha said, her voice carrying to the furthest corners of the ballroom. "I'm here as the architect of your ruin. And tonight the demolition begins." Baek looked at her, his jaw dropping as the realization finally shattered his composure. The woman he couldn't be seen with had become the only person the world was looking at. The high-contrast entry was complete. The victim was dead, and the landlord had arrived to collect the keys. The silence in the ballroom was not empty. It was heavy like the air before a storm breaks. Marsha stood at the center of the gilded circle, the gold of her gown shimmering under the relentless flash of the press cameras. Baek stood paralyzed, his champagne glass finally slipping from his hand and shattering on the marble floor. The sound was like a starting pistol. "You called me unpresentable, Baek," Marsha said, her voice amplified by the dozens of microphones clustered at the edge of the stage. "You told me you couldn't be seen with me because I was a stain on your brand. But you forgot that a brand is only as strong as its foundation." She didn't look at the crowd. She looked directly into the lens of the main broadcast camera, her gaze piercing through the living rooms of millions of viewers watching the gala of the century. With a steady hand, she pulled the black titanium card from her clutch and slid it into the reader of the podium's digital interface. On the massive LED screens behind her, screens that were supposed to display the SUNTC stock ticker and the IPO launch sequence, a different set of data appeared. The Wilshire clause materialized in stark white text against a black background. The legal architecture of the Seok family's ruin was laid bare for the world to see. The secret debt, the hidden 40% equity, and the dormant protocol that had just been triggered. Article 4, subsection C. Marsha announced, her voice a low architectural rasp. The Wilshire clause. Triggered by a bad faith severance of the bloodline. As the executor of the Wilshire Trust, and on behalf of my sons Beom-jun and Beom-min, I am now the majority voting power of the Seok group. A collective gasp rippled through the elite. Madame Seok lunged forward, her porcelain face cracking into a mask of pure rage. "This is a fabrication. Security, remove this woman. She is a ghost. She is nothing." But the security team, led by Shin, who stepped out from the wings in his dark suit, did not move. They stood like pillars of iron, their gazes fixed on Marsha. "The security team answers to the majority shareholder, Mother," Baek whispered, his voice trembling as he watched the screens. The stock price of SUNTC wasn't just falling. It was evaporating. She owns the building." Marsha turned to the board members seated in the front row. "As my first act as majority chair, I am moving for an immediate vote of no confidence. Baek Beom-seok is removed as CEO, effective immediately. Madame Seok is stripped of her honorary chair and barred from all corporate properties." The press went into a frenzy. The architect had not just arrived. She had demolished the skyscraper while everyone was still inside. Baek looked at Marsha, his eyes filled with a desperate, belated recognition of the woman he had discarded. He saw the strength he had mistaken for softness, the iron he had mistaken for mahogany. "Marsha, please," he stammered, stepping toward her. "We can talk about this. The twins. They need their father's legacy." "They have their grandfather's legacy," Marsha replied, her voice devoid of heat. "And they have a mother who knows how to build. You were never the architect, Baek. You were just the one who liked the view." She turned her back on him, walking toward the exit as the decided quiet of her transformation reached its crescendo. Behind her, the Seok Empire was a pile of golden rubble. Madame Seok was being escorted out by the very guards she had once commanded, her emerald silk trailing on the floor. Baek stood alone under the spotlights, a stain on the brand he had tried so hard to protect. Marsha stepped out into the night air, where Ruth was waiting with the car. The twins were asleep in the back, oblivious to the fact that their mother had just rewritten history. As the car pulled away from the Seok Tower, Marsha looked into the rearview mirror. She didn't see a victim. She didn't see a wife. She saw a woman who had finally finished the blueprints. The architecture of ruin was complete. The new world was just beginning.